3 weeks after I bought my first house, my brother sued me, claiming it belonged to the family fund. My parents stood by and said nothing as the police put me in handcuffs and led me away. But while they celebrated, they had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I want to tell you this story the right way, which means starting at the beginning. Not the beginning of the lawsuit, not the beginning of the arrest, but the beginning of the thing that made all of it possible. Because if you don't understand where I came from, none of what follows will make any sense. You'll just think it's a story about a bad brother and absent parents. It's not. It's a story about a system, a family system built over decades, maintained through control, and designed to make sure that no one inside it ever truly escaped. I was the second child and the only daughter. My brother was 3 years older, and from the time I was old enough to notice anything, I noticed that the rules in our house didn't apply to him the way they applied to me. This wasn't the ordinary favoritism you hear about in families. The oldest gets more responsibility, the youngest gets babied, the middle child gets lost. It was more deliberate than that. My brother was being groomed for something, not a career, not a calling, an identity. He was being trained to become the family's internal enforcer, the one who would one day manage the money and manage the people the money was used to control. My parents were not wealthy in any flashy sense. We lived in a house in the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, drove sensible cars, took road trips instead of flights, and had opinions about what constituted a reasonable grocery budget. But what they lacked in liquid assets, they made up for in the architecture of obligation. They were extraordinarily skilled at creating situations in which other people, family members mostly, felt they owed something. A loan here, a gift there, a co-signature on a lease, a holiday dinner paid for with pointed commentary about who had contributed and who had taken. Every transaction left a residue of debt that was never quite forgiven and never quite acknowledged. It just sat there, in the atmosphere of every family interaction, shaping behavior the way humidity shapes a room. My brother absorbed all of this. He watched my parents and he learned. By the time he was in his late 20s, he had developed a nearly instinctive understanding of how to use generosity as leverage, how to position himself as the reasonable party in any dispute, and how to make anyone who challenged the family's financial arrangements feel like they were the one being irrational. He was good at it. I'll give him that. I watched him too. I just drew different conclusions. The conclusion I drew around the age of 19 or 20 was simple. The only way out of this system was to never need anything from it. Not a loan, not a co-signature, not a favor, not a holiday dinner I'd feel obligated to attend because they'd paid for the turkey. Nothing. If I wanted my life to be mine, I had to build it entirely outside of their reach. And that meant starting from zero, on my own, with no help, no shortcuts, and no explanations. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't sit my parents down and explain my philosophy of financial independence. I just quietly started doing it. The first thing I did was open a bank account they didn't know about. This sounds more dramatic than it was. I was 22, a legal adult, and there was nothing preventing me from having a private bank account. But in my family, financial privacy was treated as a form of aggression. If you didn't share your numbers, your salary, your savings balance, your rent, your debt, you were being secretive, and secretiveness meant you had something to hide. And having something to hide meant you were planning something. And planning something meant you were pulling away. And pulling away was the one thing that was never, ever acceptable. The family fund, that phrase had been in circulation since I was a teenager, though it wasn't always called that. Sometimes it was called the family savings. Sometimes it was called the shared account. Sometimes it was just a reference made in passing about how the family took care of its own, made in the exact tone that let you know what was expected of you in return. I opened my account at a bank across town. I didn't use direct deposit because my parents had co-signed on my first job's paperwork and had a habit of asking about my stubs. I deposited cash. I found a second job 6 months in and kept that income entirely separate from anything I let them see. I am not by nature someone who enjoys compartmentalization. I don't like managing multiple versions of reality. It is genuinely exhausting. But I did it for 6 years because I understood clearly and early that the alternative was staying inside a system that would slowly consume whatever I built. My first job was at a customer service center for a mid-size insurance company. The pay wasn't remarkable, but the hours were predictable. The benefits were real. And the work, while not exciting, gave me something I hadn't expected, a clear, uninterrupted view of what financial problems look like from the outside. I spent 8 hours a day talking to people who were in trouble, behind on premiums, disputing claims, trying to understand coverage they'd never properly read. I am not saying this made me smarter about money than anyone else, but it gave me a daily, concrete reminder of what happened when you made assumptions, when you didn't read the documents, when you trusted someone else to manage the details on your behalf. I took that lesson seriously. My second job started 14 months after the first. 3 nights a week waitressing at a mid-range Italian place near downtown, plus both weekend mornings when the brunch rush came through. I was good at it. Fast, organized, good at reading tables and knowing when to disappear and when to appear. And the tips were better than I'd expected. On a good weekend, I walked out with $200 in cash. On a slow one, it was closer to 90. I tracked every shift in a notebook I kept in my bag. I averaged it out monthly, deposited it weekly, and watched the balance grow with a focus that I can only describe as meditative. My social life contracted sharply during those years, not because I isolated myself on purpose, but because the rhythms of 2 jobs don't leave much room for anything else, and because a lot of the social activities my friends engaged in cost money I wasn't spending. Dinners out, weekend trips, concerts, bar tabs, I said no to most of it. I had a few friends who understood and a few who took it personally, as though my saving were a judgment of their spending. It wasn't. I didn't have opinions about how other people used their money. I only had opinions about without my own. My mother asked me several times during those years what I was saving for. I told her I was just trying to build a cushion. She would nod and change the subject, and I could see she didn't quite believe me, but she couldn't prove otherwise because I'd been careful. My brother asked me once at a family dinner whether I was ever going to do something with my money or if I was just going to sit on it forever. I said I was still figuring out the plan. He made a comment about how money sitting in a savings account was basically a waste, that it should be working, that he'd be happy to talk me through some investment options that the family had been discussing. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. I never brought it up again. I want to be precise about the number because it matters. Over 6 years, across 2 jobs, with no vacations, no car payments, I drove a 2009 Honda Civic I'd bought $4,000 cash, no new furniture, generic groceries, and a social life that could generously be described as minimal. I saved $41,260. I know it down to the dollar because I kept that notebook the entire time. Every deposit, every balance, every month's total. I still have it. $41,260, and not 1 cent of it came from my family. When I hit $40,000, I opened a new tab on my laptop and started looking at houses. I want to describe what that felt like because I don't think I've ever fully articulated it to anyone. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:30 on a Tuesday night after a closing shift, still smelling faintly of garlic bread and espresso, and I typed the words houses for sale into a real estate website with a zip code, and a grid of photographs appeared on my screen. Little houses, big houses, old houses with original hardwood and updated kitchens, modest houses with small yards and attached garages, and I sat there and looked at them with the specific, almost dizzying feeling of something becoming real that had only ever existed as a number in a notebook. I was going to buy a house, my house, with my money, and nobody was going to have any part of it. I want to tell you about the house hunt because it was not romantic and it was not easy, and it is important that you understand both of those things. I spent 4 months looking. I worked with a buyer's agent named Dolores, who was patient in a way that only comes from having done something for a very long time and having made peace with the fact that most of it is waiting. She showed me 11 houses. 6 of them were immediately out of the question. Wrong neighborhood, wrong condition, wrong price relative to what the inspection would inevitably reveal. 2 of them were close but had problems I couldn't rationalize away. A foundation issue on one, a water damage history on another that the seller had disclosed, but that the remediation paperwork couldn't quite account for. One I loved and lost in a bidding situation where I simply couldn't compete. One I made an offer on and had accepted, only to have the deal fall apart 3 weeks later when the seller's divorce proceedings turned complicated and their attorney advised them not to close. That last one was the hardest. I had already mentally moved in. I had stood in the kitchen during the walkthrough and imagined where I'd put things. I had looked out the back window at the small yard and thought about a garden, just a small one, tomatoes and herbs, nothing ambitious. When Dolores called to tell me the deal was dead, I sat very still for a long time before I said anything. Then I said, okay, tell me what's next. What was next, 6 weeks later, was a house on a quiet street in a neighborhood that was neither fancy nor struggling, that had been on the market for 40 days because of a cosmetic condition issue that frightened buyers who didn't know the difference between a problem and a project. The carpets were bad. The kitchen needed updating. One bathroom had a vanity that belonged firmly in 1987, but the structure was clean. The inspection came back with nothing that made me nervous. The price had dropped twice, and for the first time in the whole process, I walked through a house and felt something shift in my chest. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter. Something more like recognition. I put in an offer that afternoon. The negotiation took 3 days. I came in $5,000 under asking. They countered at asking -2. I came back at asking -3. They accepted. I had a lawyer review every document before I signed anything. I paid for the review out of pocket, and I would do it again without hesitation, because there is no financial decision that deserves less scrutiny than a first home purchase, and I had spent 6 years making sure I understood what I was signing my name to. The closing was on a Tuesday in March, 11:15 in the morning, at a title company 15 minutes from the house. I drove there alone. I had considered for about 30 seconds telling someone, my closest friend from college maybe, a coworker I'd gotten close to over years of shared lunch breaks and mutual venting, but I didn't. I was afraid that telling someone would create a thread, and a thread would create a question, and a question asked at the wrong moment would reach the wrong ears. I was so close. 4 months of searching, 6 years of saving, 20-odd years of quietly and carefully building a life that didn't depend on anyone I was related to. I was not going to risk it with a phone call, so I drove there alone, and I sat in the waiting room of the title company reading a magazine I couldn't concentrate on. And when the closing coordinator called my name, I went into the conference room and I signed my name on 42 pages of documents. I know it was 42 because I counted. I always count. It's a habit I developed early when I understood that the details are where the traps are. When it was over, the coordinator handed me a key on a plain metal ring and told me congratulations. I thanked her. I shook Dolores's hand and thanked her too. Then I walked out of the building into the March air, got into my car, and sat there. I don't know exactly how long I sat there before I was able to drive. 10 minutes maybe, possibly 15. I was not crying. I want to be clear about that because people assume you would be crying at a moment like that, and maybe some people are, but I wasn't. I was just sitting very still with a key in my hand and a specific full feeling in my chest that I didn't have a ready word for. Relief maybe, or the particular exhaustion of having held something carefully for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. I called nobody on the drive home. The first weekend I moved in the basics. A mattress, my clothes, the contents of my kitchen that had been in boxes for 2 weeks. The second weekend, I moved the furniture I'd been slowly acquiring from estate sales and thrift shops over the previous year. Things I'd chosen quietly and stored in a unit I rented by the month specifically so I wouldn't have to explain them. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, a bookcase, a dresser with good bones and a scratched surface I planned to sand down, a reading chair in a color called teal that I had wanted since I first saw it and that had no practical justification whatsoever. I bought it anyway. I scrubbed the kitchen floor on my hands and knees with a bucket and a brush, barefoot, on a Saturday morning when the light was coming through the window at an angle that hit the tile and made it look almost golden. I painted the living room a color I had selected myself, not from a mood board, not from a suggestion, just from a paint chip I pulled out of a rack at the hardware store because it was exactly the color of late afternoon light and I wanted to live inside it. I planted 2 tomato plants in the backyard. In a raised bed I built from lumber I'd cut myself because the videos made it look manageable. And as it turned out, it was. For 3 weeks, the house was just mine. No announcements, no social media posts, no family dinners where I would have to manage the reaction, absorb the opinions, navigate the questions about who had helped and what had been contributed and whether I'd considered this or consulted that. Just mine. The floors, the walls, the kitchen, the small backyard, the reading chair in teal, the tomato plants coming up through the soil. Mine. I understood that it couldn't stay quiet forever. I just wanted those weeks. I think I deserved them. My brother found out on a Thursday evening, 22 days after I closed. I still don't know exactly how. My best working theory is a county records search. Property deeds are public record, and my brother is the kind of person who would think to set up an alert for his own last name in a deed database. That sounds paranoid when I say it out loud, but I want to be clear, it is not paranoid in the context of who he is. My brother has always been a systems thinker in the specific way that means he thinks about systems that benefit him. He thinks about information flows. He thinks about who knows what and when. He has, at various points in his adult life, known about family members' financial situations, a cousin's salary, an uncle's refinance, a family friend's inheritance dispute, before those people had told anyone in the family anything. This is not coincidence. This is methodology. So, Thursday evening, his number on my phone, and I answered because I always answered, because not answering would raise questions I wasn't ready to manage. His voice was calm. That's the first thing I need you to understand. It was not angry. It was not accusatory, not at first. It was calm in that very specific register that I had come to understand over years of watching him operate. The calm of someone who has prepared, who has thought this through, who is not reacting but executing a plan. He said he'd heard I had some news. I said I wasn't sure what he was referring to. He said he'd seen something that suggested I might have made a significant financial decision recently without discussing it with the family. I said I had bought a house. Yes, there was a pause, not a surprised pause, a pause that was more like a beat in a rehearsed speech, the moment before the next line. He said the down payment came from Grandma's estate. I said yes, in part. He said the estate belonged to all of us. I said Grandma had left that portion of the estate to me directly, and I had the documentation to prove it. He said the will wasn't the whole picture. He said that there had been understandings. That word understandings said with a specific weight that was meant to imply that I knew exactly what he meant. Understandings within the family about how the estate would be distributed, and that my purchase, made unilaterally and without consultation, had violated those understandings. I said I was not aware of any legal obligation to consult the family before making a financial decision with money that had been left to me by name in a legal document. He said that legal documents weren't the only thing that bound a family together. I said I agreed, and that in my view, neither were threats. That was the wrong thing to say, or the right thing, depending on how you measure rightness. It ended the conversation, and it also drew a line. I said I had the documentation, and I wasn't going to discuss this further, and I ended the call. I sat with my phone on the kitchen table for a long time after that, not panicking, just thinking. I went through the checklist in my head, the one I'd been maintaining mentally for the entire time I'd been saving. Had I signed anything that gave them access to or interest in those funds? No. Had I commingled anything? No. Had I accepted any money from a family account or let any family money touch mine? No. Had I ever explicitly agreed to contribute to or draw from anything called the family fund? No. The foundation was clean. I knew it was clean because I had spent 6 years making sure it was clean. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, not then, was whether my brother understood that, or whether he was planning to act anyway, on the theory that a legal threat is effective whether or not it has merit, because legal threats are expensive to defend against, and most people will fold before it ever gets to a courtroom. He had used this theory before, on our cousin, on a family friend who'd borrowed money years ago and thought the debt had been forgiven, on me once, when I was younger and less certain of my own position. I had watched him do it. I knew what it looked like in the early stages. I opened my laptop that night and found the name of the attorney who had handled my closing, Patricia. I had her card somewhere in the folder of house documents I'd organized and filed the week I moved in. I found it in about 2 minutes. I didn't call her that night. I just wanted to know I had her number. The following 3 weeks were strange in the way that waiting is always strange when you know something is coming but don't know the shape of it yet. I went to work, I waitressed my shifts, I came home to the house that was mine, and I cooked in my kitchen, and I sat in my teal chair and I read. My brother did not call again. My parents did not reach out. This silence, I understood, was not peace. It was preparation. Twice during those 3 weeks, I woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart going fast and had to talk myself through what I knew. The money was legally mine. I had the documentation. I had done nothing wrong. The anxiety was not logical, but it was not nothing either. When you grow up inside a system of control, the most persistent residue it leaves is the fear that the system will catch you no matter how far you run, that the rules of the outside world won't apply to you, because inside that system, they never did. I knew intellectually that this fear was not based in fact. I also knew that knowing something intellectually does not make it stop waking you up at 3 in the morning. On the 23rd day after my closing, 3 weeks plus 2 days, though people have since referred to it as 3 weeks, which is close enough, I woke up to a Wednesday morning that felt like any other Wednesday morning. I made coffee. I fed the 2 tomato plants on the back step. I was still in my robe when the knock came at the door. I knew before I opened it. Not specifically, I didn't know it would be that morning, that day with those 2 officers, but I knew in the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes before the sky does. I opened the door. 2 officers, both polite, both professional, their faces arranged in that particular expression of neutral bureaucracy that police officers develop when they're executing something they've been given a warrant for and have no particular personal stake in. Behind them, on the sidewalk that now ran in front of my house, my brother stood with his arms crossed. He was wearing a gray jacket with a navy collar that I recognized from a Christmas photo my mother had posted 3 years ago. He looked relaxed. He looked like someone who had won something. My parents were parked at the curb, my father's car. I recognized the make and color. My mother was in the passenger seat. She did not get out of the car. She watched through the windshield with an expression I have spent a considerable amount of time since then trying to name, and I still can't fully do it. It wasn't guilt. Guilt has a downward quality, a looking away. She wasn't looking away, she was watching. It was something more like detachment, with a seam of something complicated running through it. Some feeling she had chosen not to examine too closely, maybe, because examining it would have required a response she wasn't prepared to give. The officers told me they had a warrant related to a civil matter that had been escalated. I don't need to reproduce the exact language here. The practical outcome was that they put handcuffs on my wrists and walked me down the steps of my own house while my brother watched from the sidewalk with his arms crossed, and my parents watched from the curb, and the neighbors, whose names I was still learning, watched from wherever they were watching. I did not cry. I did not speak. I did not explain myself to anyone standing in my driveway or on my sidewalk or in the cars parked along my street. I looked at my parents one time, one long, steady look, and my father was on his phone. Actually on his phone, screen lit up, thumb moving. My mother met my eyes for about 2 seconds and then looked at her own hands. I let them put me in the back of the patrol car. I focused on 2 things: my breathing and the knowledge that I had Patricia's number memorized. The holding cell at the county precinct was small and lit by fluorescent panels that produced a light the color of old paper. There were 2 benches along opposite walls, both metal, both bolted to the floor. The floor itself was sealed concrete that had been mopped recently enough that the chemical smell was still present. There was a drain in the center of it. I sat on the bench with my back against the wall and my hands in my lap, and I looked at that drain for a long time. There was one other person in the cell, a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, who had the specific exhausted patience of someone who had been in this situation before and had made peace with the waiting. She did not look at me when I came in. She was looking at the wall. I was grateful for her indifference. I had been told at the precinct desk that I would be allowed 1 call. I used it carefully. Patricia's office number was the one I'd memorized. I'd gone back to my house documents folder the morning after my brother's call and actually memorized it. 7 digits after the area code, running through it in my head on the drive to work, on my breaks, in the quiet before I fell asleep. It felt excessive at the time. It felt like the kind of thing anxious people do, which I am, though I've learned over the years to channel that anxiety into preparation rather than paralysis. Standing at the precinct phone, I was very glad I had been excessive. Patricia answered on the 2nd ring. It was mid-afternoon on a Wednesday and she was in the office and she answered herself. Not an assistant, just her voice coming through the receiver. Professional, alert, not surprised to be receiving a call. I told her who I was. She remembered me immediately. We had spent enough time together over the closing process that I wasn't just a file number to her. I told her in 4 sentences what had happened. My brother had sued me claiming the house belonged to the family fund. A fraud claim had been filed. I had been arrested, and I was calling from a holding cell. I said it plainly, the way she had taught me, without editorializing, without the emotional weight that would have made it harder to process quickly. She asked me one question. Did you sign anything granting them access to or interest in those funds? No. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds. In my experience, Patricia's pauses are meaningful. She does not pause because she is thinking of what to say next. She pauses because she is taking in information and organizing it, and when she speaks again, it will be precise. This pause was the kind that meant she had heard something that changed the shape of the situation. She said, "They just opened a door they cannot close." She said she would be there within the hour, and that I should not speak to anyone about the specifics of the financial arrangements until she was present. She said this clearly and without dramatics, in the same tone you'd use to explain a straightforward procedure. I went back to the bench and looked at the drain. While I waited, I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Rosalie. She had grown up poor, genuinely poor, the kind of poor that meant not enough food some weeks and a single pair of good shoes you wore until the soles separated, and she had spent her entire adult life building something out of nothing through a combination of stubbornness and what she called clear-eyed practicality. She married a man who turned out to be gentle and unremarkable and who died young, and she raised her children, my mother and her 2 siblings, on a secretary's salary and the proceeds from a small investment she'd made in a friend's dry cleaning business in 1972 that had paid off modestly but consistently for the next 20 years. By the time I was old enough to know her as a person rather than just as a grandmother, she was in her late 60s and she was sharp in a way that cut quietly. She did not talk about about herself much. She asked questions. She listened with full attention in a way that most people don't, watching your face while you talked, noting the things you didn't say. She baked obsessively and gave things away. Bread, cookies, jars of jam, not from sentimentality, but I think from the same practicality that ran through everything she did. She had made things and she wanted them used. She watched my family with the clear eyes of someone who had created them and was not, despite this, under any illusions about them. I was her favorite. I say this not with the self-congratulation of someone who won a competition, but with the plain acknowledgement of someone who was told, directly and more than once. Rosalie was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. When I was 12, she told me that out of all the grandchildren, I was the one she didn't worry about. Not because I was the smartest or the most capable, but because I was the one who looked at things honestly. She said most people see what they want to see. She said I seemed to see what was actually there. She said she didn't know yet whether that would make my life easier or harder, but she thought it would probably make it mine. I was 14 when she said this and I didn't fully understand it. I do now. She died when I was 27, 6 months before I began the house search. She was 81 and her death was not sudden. She had been slowing for 2 years in the way that people slow when the machinery of the body begins its final renegotiation, but it was still a loss that I did not fully feel until weeks afterward in the gaps. The quiet of a Sunday morning without the possibility of calling her. The habit of thinking I should tell Rosalie this, and then remembering. Her estate was not large by any external measure. A house, a modest investment account, some jewelry, the dry cleaning partnership which had long since wound down. She had a will, prepared by an estate attorney named Gerald Voss, who had been handling her documents since the early 90s. The will divided the estate among her 3 children and 5 grandchildren in proportions that were, on the surface, roughly equivalent. What I didn't know, what no one in the family knew, was what else was in Gerald's files. Patricia arrived at the precinct at 4:47. I know this because I had been watching the clock on the wall above the door since my call. She walked in with a leather portfolio under one arm and the particular energy of someone who has spent decades walking into rooms where the situation was not in her favor and was comfortable there anyway. She was shown to a meeting room. I was brought to her 5 minutes later. She set the portfolio on the table and opened it before she said anything else. The first thing she said was, "Your grandmother was thorough." I looked at her. She said it again. Thorough. She said it like a compliment, and I understood that she meant it as one, because thorough in Patricia's vocabulary is one of the highest things you can be. She turned the portfolio to face me, and I saw, for the first time, documents I had never seen before. Rosalie had been thorough. She had been more than thorough. She had 8 months before she died put in place a protection so precisely constructed that it was going to dismantle my brother's case, not like knocking over a wall, but like pulling the foundation out from under it so quietly that he wouldn't feel it until he was already falling. I looked at the documents. I looked up at Patricia, and for the first time since the handcuffs had closed around my wrist that morning, I felt the specific, clarifying calm of someone who has just realized they were always going to be okay. They just hadn't known it yet. Here is what Rosalie had done and why it worked. 8 months before she died, she had called Gerald Voss into her home for what her family understood to be a routine estate planning review. She had done these reviews periodically, every few years, as a matter of discipline, the same way she reviewed her investment statements and her insurance policies. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody attended. It was not a family event. It was, as it had always been, Rosalie's private business, which she handled privately because she had never in her life believed that other people's involvement in her financial affairs was either necessary or welcome. What she did at that meeting was this. She amended her estate documents to create a restricted sub-account within her investment portfolio. The sub-account held approximately $32,000, a portion of the investment account that had, until that amendment, been categorized as general estate assets. After the amendment, it was categorized differently. It was held in trust, in my name, accessible only to me upon her death, with no co-beneficiaries, no co-signatories, and no requirement for family consultation or approval. The language Gerald used in the amendment was specific and deliberate. Rosalie had apparently asked him to make it as clear as possible that no other family member had any claim on or interest in those funds, for any reason, under any interpretation of the documents. She also, on that same day, dictated a letter. The letter was addressed to Gerald. It was not addressed to me, or to my parents, or to my brother. It was addressed to Gerald, and it was intended for his files, to be produced in the event of any legal challenge to the sub-account. It was 2 pages long. It was signed by Rosalie, witnessed by Gerald and his paralegal, and notarized by a notary public who worked out of the same office building. Patricia slid a copy of that letter across the table to me in the precinct meeting room. I read it. I will not reproduce it in its entirety, but I will tell you what it said, because what it said matters. It said that Rosalie was creating this sub-account because she had observed over many years a pattern within her family of using financial arrangements, including estate expectations, shared accounts, and the concept of family funds as tools of control over individual family members. She wrote this plainly, without hostility, but without euphemism. She said she did not believe that pattern was malicious in origin, but that its effects were nonetheless real and ongoing, and that she had watched one family member in particular, and here she used my name, absorb the costs of that pattern without complaint and without anyone in the family adequately acknowledging what was being asked her. She said she was creating the sub-account to provide that family member with a financial foundation that could not be reached by the family's patterns. She said she had chosen not to tell me about it while she was alive because she understood that knowledge of the account might create pressure or conflict that she wasn't in a position to manage from a hospital bed. said. She said she had told Gerald to tell me about it only after her death, and only through a controlled disclosure that minimized the opportunity for interference. She said she was fully competent at the time of writing, was under no duress, had discussed the matter with Gerald over 2 separate meetings, and had made the decision freely and with full understanding of its implications. She said she loved her family, and she was not making this decision out of anger. She said she was making it because she had looked at things honestly, and she thought I deserved someone who would do the same for me. I put the letter down on the table. I don't want to be dramatic about what I felt in that moment. I have a reflexive suspicion of dramatic feelings because they have, in my experience, often been used by the people around me as substitutes for action. But I will tell you that I sat in that precinct meeting room with a letter from my dead grandmother in front of me, and I felt something that I am still not sure I have the right word for. It was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it too. It was something more like being seen clearly by someone who loved you years in advance when you weren't even looking. She had watched me. She had understood what I was dealing with and what I was trying to do, and she had moved first, quietly, the way she did everything, not with fanfare, not with announcements, but with precision and thoroughness and the specific kindness of someone who knew that the best help is the kind that's already in place before you know you need it. Patricia gave me a moment. She is good at reading rooms. When she spoke again, her voice was measured. She said, "What your brother filed is a criminal fraud complaint, not just a civil suit, and he filed it with no evidence of any crime, against someone who committed no crime, using the legal system as a tool of intimidation, rather than a legitimate vehicle for dispute resolution." She said this was a serious mistake, not just tactically but legally. I said, "How serious?" She said, "Serious enough that I am already considering our next move rather than our response." She said that the wire transfer records, the sub-account amendment, and Rosalie's letter were collectively airtight. She said that the civil claim was going to collapse because there was no legal basis for it and the documentation proved it. She said that the criminal fraud complaint was a different matter because filing a false criminal complaint is itself illegal, and the evidence trail was going to make it very clear that my brother had known, or should have known, that the complaint was without merit. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Tonight I get you out of here. Tomorrow we start taking this apart." She stood up, closed her portfolio, and smoothed her jacket, and she looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a problem this clean. I was released at 7:43 that evening. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a form to sign, a property return, my phone, my keys, my wallet, and the quiet removal of the administrative machinery that had been treating me as a defendant. I signed my name and walked out into a parking lot where Patricia was waiting beside her car. The air was cold and thin and tasted different from the precinct air. I stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed it in. Patricia handed me my phone. 14 missed calls, 11 text messages. My brother had called twice, my mother 3 times, my father once. The long text from my brother began with the phrase, "We are only trying to protect what is ours." I put the phone in my pocket without reading the rest. Patricia walked me to my car and gave me instructions for the next 24 hours. Go home, sleep if I could. No communication with my brother or my parents by any channel. Nothing online. Call her at 9 the next morning. I said, "What happens after that?" She said, "After that, we dismantle them." I drove home. The house was the way I had left it. The coffee mug I hadn't finished. The reading chair in teal by the window. The grocery list on the counter. All of it exactly where I had left it, untouched, because the house was mine and nobody had been in it. I washed the mug, made dinner, read my brother's messages in order. The long message restated the family fund claim, characterized my purchase as a betrayal, and carefully replaced the phrase "my grandmother's estate" with the family's estate throughout, as though Rosalie's assets had always been communal property, rather than the private accumulation of 81 years of her own work. There was no acknowledgement of the arrest, no question about whether I was okay. The short message said, "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." My mother's text described the situation as deeply upsetting, asked me to think about what this was doing to the family, and contained the phrase, "I hope you know we love you" twice in 3 messages. She had watched them put me in handcuffs from the passenger seat of my father's car and said nothing. Now she was texting me to say she hoped I knew she loved me. I put the phone face down on the table and did not look at it again that night. I slept better than I expected to. My brother came to the house on the 4th day. He was on my front step, hands in his pockets, standing differently than he had stood on the sidewalk behind the officers, the way people stand when they're not sure of their footing but trying not to show it. He said things had gotten out of hand, said nobody had wanted it to go as far as it had, said he was sorry I'd had to go through what I'd gone through, the non-apology, constructed to acknowledge impact without conceding fault. I said, "You had me arrested." He said, "The situation escalated beyond what anyone intended." I said, "You filed a fraud complaint against me for purchasing property with money that was legally mine, knowing you had no evidence of fraud because no fraud occurred. And now you're at my door telling me things escalated beyond what anyone intended." He looked at the door frame rather than at me. I held up the copy of Rosalie's letter that I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket for 4 days. I told him what it was. A letter from our grandmother to her estate attorney. Signed, witnessed, notarized, explaining exactly why she had created the sub-account and what she intended by it. Patricia had the original. It was now part of the formal record. He looked at the letter. His face went quiet. Not the controlled quiet of someone managing a situation, just quiet, the way a room goes quiet when the sound is turned off. He said, "She would have talked to us if we'd known she was doing this. We could have." I said, "She knew you would have tried to stop it. That's exactly why she didn't tell you." He had no answer. I said I had nothing else to say to him, and I closed the door. I stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps, the car door, the engine, the tires, and then silence. I picked up the grocery list and kept writing. The formal hearing was 2 weeks after my release. Patricia had requested an expedited date, and it was granted. I sat beside her. My brother was across the aisle with his attorney. My parents sat in the row behind him. The courtroom was small and fluorescent lit, the kind used for procedural matters. My brother's attorney performed reasonable grievance well. The family's long-standing expectations, shared familial understandings, collective decision-making precedent, measured, sympathetic, making the unjust sound sensible through calm delivery. Then Patricia stood up. She handed the judge the wire transfer records, the sub-account amendment, and Rosalie's letter. She stated, without embellishment, that the funds had been transferred to me by legitimate means, that I had signed nothing granting any other party any interest in those funds, and that a criminal fraud complaint had been filed against someone who had committed no crime. The judge read the letter. He took his time with it. He dismissed the civil claim. He stated the property was solely mine and that the documentation established this beyond any reasonable dispute. He also noted that the court would be referring the criminal fraud complaint to the district attorney's office for review. My brother's shoulders dropped. My mother inhaled sharply behind him. My father looked at his hands. The hearing lasted 38 minutes. Outside, Patricia said, "That was clean." In her vocabulary, the highest compliment available. The tomato plants have 3 small roots between them now, hard and green and not yet ready. I check them every morning. They're taking their time. That's fine. The reading chair is where I put it. The kitchen table still has the scratch I keep meaning to refinish. The floor is the one I scrubbed on my hands and knees the first weekend. Mine. All of it mine. My brother, I've been told, is consulting a new attorney. My parents have described me to relatives as going through something. I find this neither concerning nor softening. I am not going through something. I went through something for a long time and now I am on the other side of it. Rosalie told me when I was 14 that she didn't know whether seeing things clearly would make my life easier or harder, but she thought it would probably make it mine. She was right. It is mine. My brother thought he was taking my house. He handed my grandmother the last word. She had been waiting to give it for years.